Thank you, Sam. Um, so I'm Chris Mitchell, and I'm sharing my screen. That should pop up here shortly. We have a presentation. My colleague Sean and I will go back and forth a bit to cover the items, as Samantha noted. Um, I will say that we hope to have a good time for Q&A at the end, and are of course open for future Q&A, whether that's right after the call or the future Tuesday open houses. Sean and I would love to dig more into these issues because this is a real challenge. Going to move ahead here. But if you have questions throughout, just throw them in the chat. Someone else might be able to help out. If Sean or I, whichever one is not speaking, might be able to offer a little bit of insight, or we can come back to it. So feel free to jump in and throw things into the chat right away. Now, as for what we're doing here today, I think a question that we have gotten the sense is on many people's minds is, why are we doing all of this broadband planning and thinking about various aspects of the different components of building, operating, financing, network, doing digital equity, when we're hoping that someone will be getting money from the federal government via our state in the program known as BEAD to solve those issues. And the experience that Sean and I have had suggests that this will probably not be solved by BEAD. We think that BEAD will help quite a bit for rural infrastructure, and the digital equity components of it will help to get devices out and get people training and hopefully help with some affordability, although we'll talk about that more toward the end. That's somewhat in doubt right now. But I've been doing this for 16 years, which seems like a long time. It's longer than many other people. Sean's been thinking about this for a long time and really focused on it for several years. And one of the things that we just observed is that these challenges will be ongoing. There is no scenario in which in 2 years, most of your communities are sitting back thinking, oh, God, we don't have any broadband programs, any broadband problems anymore. You will have broadband programs because you will still have problems to solve. And so that is where being locally organized is going to be really helpful. So that's why we're here. Now, what we're going to do with this time is going to just do a quick tech refresher to make sure you're confident about some of the technologies involved. That'll be very quick. Talking a bit about why community engagement is key, but then really illustrating that with real world examples through a variety of different approaches and even to different solutions, infrastructure, digital equity focus, in order to demonstrate how different communities have come together with different strategies and different kinds of people to resolve these issues. I'll talk briefly about the ACP, and then we will be trying to reiterate what we think were the key takeaways, but are always open to correction on that. Sean, why don't you do our quick refresher?
All right. Thank you, and hello, everybody. There will not be a pop quiz at the end of this, so you don't need to jot down furious notes. But just real quickly, this is, I think, good context as we talk about communities, states, and what the federal government is funding. So whether you're talking about new networks that are built with BEAD funds or other forms of financing, and there's an array, these are the last mile connective technologies that will be in play. DSL, cable, and fiber. If you'll recall, DSL, I'll just say that it's a copper wiring network. It's very old and antiquated. It's a lot of the big telecommunication companies are abandoning their DSL lines. And if you're relying on DSL, unless you live really close to a switching station or a switching location, speed is woefully inadequate, wouldn't even meet the minimum definition of broadband. In fact, pigeons, as Doug Dawson recently wrote about in his pots and pan psychology, pigeons have been shown to get bigger files to the recipient faster than a DSL connection would if you were trying to email something important. Cable networks are the way most Americans get their internet access, through a cable connection. They can be a great solution for some folks, but often don't meet communities' overall needs. They tend to be expensive. The service can be spotty in places. They're pretty good on it's pretty good on download, not so much on upload, which has become increasingly important. And then there is what I call the king of connectivity, or some other moniker, but the gold standard, that's a better term, the gold standard of internet connectivity, which is fiber. Most new networks that are being built are fiber networks, but that's not to say that wireless technology isn't very much a part of the mix. And then real quickly, wireless technology, we can go to the next slide. Wireless technology is still mostly wired. You see that picture there of a cell tower. You got fiber that, so these towers are all connected with fiber, or at least in the backhaul to the larger internet. But wireless technology is very, very cool. I mean, who likes wires, right? But as I said, still, wires are still about 99% of the internet. We've got our mobile cellular networks for our phones, which are great when we're out and about, though they're not sufficient to handle household needs. And then you've got fixed wireless. If you see the acronym FWA in this space, fixed wireless access, that's what it stands for. Fixed wireless access can be a great solution for some communities because it can very much, it's progressed to the point where it can meet household needs depending on the terrain. Flat areas is where you get the best coverage, but it tends to struggle in mountains because not only is it difficult to drill in the mountains to lay fiber, it turns out it's also very difficult to deliver a wireless signal in mountainous regions, particularly around line of sight. So those are the technologies that are at play and can give you a sort of a ballpark or a rough idea of what kind of technologies are being considered, and also give you an idea, again, fiber connectivity being the gold standard, as to why the BEAD program prioritizes fiber networks. Won't fund only fiber networks, but it certainly prioritizes them. On the next slide here.
So, Sean, just before you advance, I just want to note quickly that satellite has also gotten a lot better, but the cost of satellite are still quite large, and you're not going to get the really economic development benefits that come with other kinds of deployments. And so that may be okay for the most difficult to reach areas. Recently on an event I was at physically, the broadband person for the state of Maryland suggested that most areas of Maryland, I think he might have said all of Maryland, is in a situation where signing up for the Starlink service is getting you on waiting lists because it is over capacity. So if you are hearing from people that satellite will solve all of our rural issues, it will not. It is wonderful for certain deployments. If you're fighting a forest fire out west, it is a lifesaver, literally, but it is not going to solve all of our rural broadband needs either. So with that, I'll advance.
Cool. So one of the big reasons why I would say it's key for local communities to be involved, because the technology aside, it is important that we have a general understanding of the technologies that are being considered. However, technology aside, and one of the things that I think, or at least we hope that you come away from this presentation and like others, is that we don't want you to get bogged down in the mysteries of the technology, because fundamentally what we are talking about are not technological problems so much as they are other types of challenges. And that is why local communities become vital keys to solving the digital divide. So again, the technology aside, questions about where to build and who needs what, the people who know that best are the people living closest to the connectivity challenges, the people in local communities. But local leaders often assume someone else will fix the problem, as Chris alluded to, and we have found that not to be the case. Chris likes to say, and I hope I'm not stealing his thunder, but if you were to randomly call, or if I were to randomly call a public works department in any city or county and ask them about asphalt or concrete, you're going to be able to talk to a whole bunch of folks that will tell you all about gradients and how roads are built and engineered and how long they'll last, et cetera, et cetera. But virtually no one in local government knows much about broadband at all. And so local communities that figure out this stuff are the ones that end up getting a solution that works for the entire community. It's challenging, but if this were easy, it would have been done by now. I mean, think about how challenging some of these issues may be in your minds, in terms of promoting digital equity locally and all that that entails, all of the infrastructure questions and how networks are built and the technologies, how challenging that is. Now consider doing that in a place that you've never even visited before, because that is exactly what state and federal lawmakers and policymakers are facing now. So all the more reason that local communities are extremely, extremely important. There's another reason. It's not a small reason, but it's not the only reason. But another reason why it's very important that we don't just sort of say, oh, well, here's BEAD. The federal government's funding it. The monies will be, doled out to ISPs and everything will be fixed. Go to the next slide there. One of the reasons why we say that with such confidence is because when you look at the track record of federal broadband funding programs, it's not exactly rosy. So we go back to the Connect America Fund, or what they call CAF. In that program, 10 of the largest telecommunication companies in the country got a $1.5 billion a year for several years. There were minimal build out requirements. Much of that money, though, was not used to upgrade the copper wires to fiber or to really upgrade networks, but really they took the money and still offered DSL or maybe fixed wireless that delivered a underwhelming, say 10 megabit per second download speeds. Not what we need for broadband, certainly then, and certainly not now. But unfortunately, they thought that CAF went so well, they said, let's do another one, except bigger. And that's what CAF 2 was. Then, was it 2 years ago, I think, they decided to establish the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. That ultimately was a $9 billion reverse auction. That's pretty widely considered to be a disaster. I mean, yes, some electric cooperatives got some good grant money out of there, but overall the program has been riddled with problems and defaults, etc. In fact, the results have been so bad that when Congress and the White House started thinking about BEAD, one thing they were clear on: we're not giving this money to the FCC to dole out again. We want to at least get it closer to where the problems are and allocate money to the various states, and that's what is what led to the BEAD program. But the key lesson here isn't to remember really anything about CAF or RDOF or this, but just that relying on these federal funding programs to magically solve these issues, the track record indicates that that is not a good bet to make. The federal government, as it says here on the slide, has allocated some serious dollars, and we haven't gotten very far because here we are. So it really underscores the need to not only for local community engagement, but to think about alternative models and solutions. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Chris.
And I want to emphasize that one of the things we've seen is that Congress has been willing to put money into this, and the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, has been willing to spend money as well. It's just that these problems are very difficult to solve. I think those programs were flawed from the start, but I also just think these are very difficult problems to solve. Now, one of the reasons that they've been difficult is that we've been using the wrong tools, I think. And I have been long talking about this report from Connect Humanity, which might be 2 years old now. And the report is a wonderful report. It is in depth. It has a lot of information about different approaches and is very full of information. I mean, it is dense. And so don't be intimidated by it and don't feel like you have to understand every last word of it. I would say to dig into it. There's a link to it there. But the key insight is that this isn't a situation where we should be, I think, blaming the big cable and telephone companies for this problem entirely. I'll sometimes say that we don't go to McDonald's and ask them what their problem is to feed humanity, right? That's not their job. Too many people assume that making connections everywhere, making sure that every family is able to access the internet is a job of moving bits, which is what Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, CenturyLink, those companies, they move bits, and like in many circumstances, they're good at it. But the issue of trying to actually make sure that communities that have been left behind by policy, by investment, those communities, it's a question of poverty, it's a question of power, it's not a question of technology. And so we argue a lot about technology because that's easy. But the issues that we're dealing with are problems of power and poverty. And it's really helpful to, I think, put that framing forward as you're thinking about this, because this is not something where, and I've heard it for more than 10 years, oh, this new technology on the horizon is going to solve it. We're not going to have an issue anymore. And it's never happened. It's not going to happen. These are issues that will be with us that we need to resolve because they're interconnected. And so anyway, the report in the entire globe, half of the world is not connected. In the United States, it's about 20% of the United States is not connected. Connecting those folks is often going to require a different approach, a different business model than the business models that worked well at connecting the first half or so. So this isn't a matter of us saying those guys are bad, or those people are bad, or those companies are all to blame. It's understanding that we are at a state in which we need to try different approaches that are more appropriate to the specific problem. Sean, was I going to do this? This is the community network. So Sean and I are trading off here because we both have done some aspects of this before, but we both have different expertise in different parts of this program. But community broadband networks are a large part of that other approach. These are networks that are often not motivated solely by profit. These are networks that are motivated by a need to serve the community. And they often want to break even. They're often collecting revenue, but they may or may not pay their full way, depending on how they're structured. Fundamentally, they are about improving the community, making sure people are well connected, and solving that issue. Some of these are owned by cities. Some of these are a nonprofit arrangement. Some of these are a cooperative that has been offering an infrastructure service for almost 100 years. In some cases, some of them are tribal governments. And actually, I would say that even some of them are for-profit companies that are locally rooted. And this is where, some people might say that's heresy, but some of the small for-profit companies we see investing in their communities act more like a nonprofit in some ways. So there's a variety. And I'll also say that having a cooperative network or a community network is not a panacea. They can be run by people that make bad decisions. And so there are challenges no matter what solution you go at. However, we tend to study these networks very in depth. So before I hand it back to Sean, I will note that the community approach has resulted in significant investment across the United States. Now, this map is complicated and difficult to digest, but the key is that the dark orange colors that you see there, those are telephone cooperatives that have invested in fiber optic service to residents. So yes, almost every last person in North Dakota that is not living in Fargo or Grand Forks has fiber to the home. They've had it in many cases for 10 years. These are areas in that upper northwest part where there are one household per square mile, incredibly low density. And they had it before a lot of the federal programs were even putting real money into these networks because the telephone cooperatives were focused locally. We'll talk, we'll name check Jackson County again in the future with People's Telephone. They have a fiber to the home network because they took advantage of funds that were available. If you look on the western slope of Colorado, there's several networks that are being built there, often by electric cooperatives. There are places where there are significant municipal broadband investments. Those are the green ones. And so there are a variety of approaches. And what links these places is that they have a locally based, community-focused provider, and specifically a nonprofit one. If you look at Illinois and parts of Wisconsin, Illinois, but in some of Indiana as well, you have a lot of local companies that are for-profit that have also made these investments. But this map is just looking at the nonprofit ones, and it's based on data that is actually pre-pandemic, as we are trying to get our hands on some of the new data. and figuring out how it works. We have done a very poor job of collecting data in the United States, but that's a different presentation, and we go into that. But just is to give you a sense of a lot of what you see in terms of the best areas to get rural internet access. They're not areas that are wealthy, right? Like Loudoun County outside of Washington, D.C., one of the wealthiest counties in the United States, has tremendously poor internet service because they don't have a local community solution that has focused on doing this in an area that is more challenging. So that I just want to give you a sense, because it is important for you to realize there are possible solutions. There's a lot of work to be done, but you should not have the sense that this is something that you will not see in your lifetime. I believe, let's hope that we all live long, healthy lives, but we're going to see a lot of these problems resolved in just the next 5 to 10 years. And sooner with BEAD, but there will still be challenges we're mopping up in 5 to 10 years in terms of availability. Sean?
Next slide. Thank you. Thank you. Well said. So what you're looking at here actually is a screenshot of our website, communitynets.org. And the reason why we put this up here, because much of what we're talking about here today, in fact, all of what we're talking about here today, other than this presentation, you can find some form, fashion on our website, Community Nets. And when I say it's a storehouse of information specifically around community broadband networks, we've got over 4,000 stories. Chris, as you might be able to guess, he likes to talk about this, and he does so every week on his Community Broadband Bits that he hosts, the Community Broadband Bits podcast. We've got to connect this, a live stream show where we talk about these issues. We've got a number of reports and fact sheets, etc. And so we track I guess you could say, the birth and development of community broadband networks across the country. And this is the way you access a lot of that information. And one of the stories, as we go into our next slide, one of the stories that is not only something that you can read quite a bit about on our on Community Nets, but it also is something near and dear to my heart because I live in the state of Massachusetts, actually. So you see the little state of Massachusetts there, and it says, "What's up with the hill towns?" I live on the part that is the part of Massachusetts that's sticking out like a bended arm or an arm making a muscle. I live on that part. But out in the western part of the state are about 24 or so towns that they call hill towns. And so when I say hill towns, I suppose, mound towns, even though it rhymes, doesn't quite have that same ring, but these are towns of various elevation, nothing that matches the Appalachian Mountains. But there are a number of rural communities in Western Massachusetts who face connectivity challenges, much like you're finding in your region in particular. And the case out there was basically, up until very recently, in the past over the past, say, 5 to 7 years or so, most of those towns, you're talking about Verizon DSL or nothing. So the options are not many. And one of the stories that I put together that looked at one particular town, and these are towns of about several hundred people, say 300 to 400, maybe as high as 800 to 900 in some of these towns. But Beckett is one of those small hill towns in Western Massachusetts. And as you can see here, this quote from one of the gentlemen that I spoke with in that community, Jeff Piemont, who was a volunteer community member who ended up raising his hand because this was an issue that meant a lot to him and people in his community. And so he raised his hand and got very involved in this issue. And he's one example of what was beginning to dawn on people in that live in these towns across Western Massachusetts, which is that we need to join the 21st century. We need to have the kind of telecommunication infrastructure that you can find in the big cities that just simply doesn't exist here because DSL really isn't going to cut it. So if we hop in a little time machine and go back to about 2008 is when these towns started to come together, and they said, let's join up. Let's try to figure this out together. And so they created an organization known as Wired West that required, a majority vote in what they call town meeting in New England. About 24 towns eventually ended up voting to join Wired West by an overwhelming majority. And this, again, remember, this is way before the pandemic, where they were realizing that high-speed internet access, as it says here in their vision, is not a necessity, is a necessity and not a luxury. But they also very much understood that we need to come together as a region and see if we can wrap our mind around this, because frankly, small rural areas and small rural markets are simply not very attractive to, bigger ISPs who don't see, the return on investment being worth the capital expenditure to build, fiber networks or really much of any type of high-speed internet networks. And so essentially they got together and said, you know what, we think we can do this thing. And the state was like, yeah, maybe we should help. And so the state, again,
Sean, you're shortening it a little bit too much there. The state at first was like, no, this is not a good idea. Only eventually did the state come around and say it would help. That was like 5 years later.
That's right. I guess I'm not trying to throw my state leaders entirely under the bus, but the point being is that with what started as a group of communities coming together eventually was enough to turn the tide to convince the state to indeed invest some state funds to support the startup capital that they would need to build out these networks. In the course of that, they ended up developing a relationship with Westfield Gas and Electric, which is a municipal electric utility that had been in existence in Westfield, Massachusetts for close to a century. Again, much like electric cooperatives, had been providing electric service for decades. So they owned the poles, they had the fiber trucks, they had the know-how. And from that, they created a subsidiary known as Whip City Fiber, which is their fiber internet business. And so Westfield Gas and Electric partnered with the Wired West towns, as it were, to build out fiber networks all across the Berkshires and these small rural towns in Western Massachusetts. And Whip City Fiber operates as the internet service provider. And so now in some of these small towns, in fact, in just about all of these small towns in Western Massachusetts, you're getting fiber service, or you're getting service that rivals anything that you'll find in Boston at rates that in most cases are much lower. Now, we hop on a jet, fly partway across the country to Ohio, Fairlawn, Ohio. Not a rural community. It's a city. It's a small city, though, of about 10,000 or so residents. But similar story, where they were a community who realized that, well, first of all, the mayor went on an overseas trip, as a lot of mayors do, to try to, lure businesses to consider relocating their operations in their city. And that's what the mayor did. The mayor of Fairlawn did. And except that when he went over there, he didn't go over there knowing really anything about broadband or even thinking about broadband until he started hearing businesses saying, yeah, but what kind of, do you have fiber service there? What kind of telecommunication infrastructure you have there? Because if it's not good, we ain't coming. That coupled with businesses within the community who were coming to city leaders saying, look, we're going to have to think about relocating if internet service here isn't vastly improved, despite the fact that two major national cable providers, or I should say a major national cable provider and a big telecom company, were providing service in there. It just wasn't adequate to meet the needs of primarily the business community, but certainly a number of citizens. And so the mayor and the city council said, you know what? Let's go ask the incumbents if they'll build out a better network that reaches the entire community. And they all kind of shrugged and said, not interested. So that led the city to say, we're going to have to build it ourselves. They did this prior to BEAD. They used no federal grants. They used no state grants. They went to the bond market. Today, that city has, through their fiber network, which is called Fairlawn Gig, it's a fiber to the home service that covers the entire city. They now have a 68% take rate. That means 68% of the households that live in Fairlawn subscribe for service. In fact, they're doing so well that last year, while we were all concerned about inflation, Fairlawn Gig announced that they were slashing prices and upping speeds. And so now you can get a symmetrical gig for $55 a month.
So go ahead. Do you want to wrap up?
No, no, go ahead.
So in Fairlawn, we wanted to include because they are a city where there was service that would be described as being even well served by the Federal Communications Commission statistics and whatnot, but they still recognized they had a need. They organized around it. They were a city that did not have municipal electricity, and they built a network. They were able to. They were a fairly wealthy community in that they could tap into the bond market and that sort of a thing. And so is you're never going to find the perfect example for your community if you're saying, oh, this doesn't apply to us because of this or another thing. Every community is unique, but there are parallels. Now, I wanted to go back into New Hampshire for a second and talk about an approach there where people in the community. Let me start by saying New Hampshire is also really struggles to have decent internet access. The population densities are low. There's not a sense that people will pay a lot of money. We should say more than $100 a month for internet service. And so there was not a lot of investment from the cable and telephone companies that were there already. And as there are now 200 there are now about 200 cooperative electric companies, which is to say, there was like 800 electric cooperatives that brought electricity to most of North America, where the United States, within the United States. 200 of those are offering fiber optic service now. But back when there was only like 75 or so of them that had done it, people that were in the New Hampshire Electric Co-op that were members of it said, we should do broadband too. We need fiber. No one's investing in our community. The co-op has trucks. It has the ability to handle wires. We should get into doing this. And the electric co-op manager said no. And the board said, no, we are not interested. That sounds like a big headache. We are not here to have a big headache. We think someone else should solve the broadband problem. So these folks in one of the communities got together and they recognized that they could change the charter of the cooperative with a 2/3 vote. So they need like 65, 66% of the vote to change the wording to officially give themselves authority and to give a kick in the butt of the co-op to say, do fiber broadband. The co-op was staunchly opposed to it. People organized. They got 63% of the vote. You might think, oh, what a kick in the teeth. You do all that work and you come so close. And I've seen this elsewhere too. But what happened was the board got the message and they were like, a majority of our members think this is really important. And so they got into it and they are now organizing that. There's not the only one. There's a couple other stories. And they often, the other one is that we talk about is Delta Montrose, which is on the western slope of Colorado in the mountains, where having those assets was really helpful. There's two things that you should take away from that. I think one is you're not going to win all the time, but sometimes, like losing gives you a path to then winning because you demonstrate power, you show that there's an interest in the community. Now, while this is happening in New Hampshire, you have this company that's now called Consolidated, but there was a history of telephone companies that did not invest in the area. And Consolidated has now struck bargains with, I believe, more than 24 towns, where the town borrows money, builds the network, and a fiber optic network, and then the telephone company Consolidated operates it on an exclusive lease and guarantees the debt payment for the city. It's an arrangement that seems to be working out. I'll say it's not Sean and Mai's favorite in terms of unlocking community benefits, but it's a heck of a lot better than not having good internet access. And so we've seen a variety of different approaches up there in New England, and some of them, in some cases they didn't work with the existing provider, and sometimes the existing provider then looks around and says, "Wow, we have to do something, or else someone else is going to come in here, and we're going to lose all of our market share." And so that may provide an impetus for a different kind of arrangement. We are not seeing the biggest telephone companies doing those kinds of deals. Consolidated, I think, is like the 5th or 6th biggest. But we think that there might be a future in which there are more partnerships along those lines. So speaking of interesting partnerships and, again, rural organizing, in Renville and Sibley counties in Minnesota, we had an effort that I was deeply involved with, at least in chronicling. I can't take credit for any of the hard work that was performed by a guy named Mark Erickson and a team of other people for the communities. He worked as a part-time economic development person, part-time town administrator for a small town in Minnesota, Winthrop. And the town said, we need to figure out an internet solution. So he went around to other towns, organized them together, and they thought they were going to do a joint powers agreement with the county. They were going to raise the money and build a community-owned, publicly owned fiber to the home network. The county board changed its mind kind of last second, and people just felt really, really angry and frustrated. They had spent years getting to that point, doing community surveys. They had, in terms of organizing it, they'd done lawn signs. They had done direct mail to every address in the county twice, which was 8,000 addresses with a packet of information to explain what they were doing, why they were doing it, why it was important. And they got tremendous support. And then the county decided not to do it. And we cover all this in this report. There's a link to it there, and you can get to it from the notes. But on after that vote in the evening, they all went to one of the local bars where the county board had met. And they went to a bar, which is actually a community-owned bar. This is how small these places are. There's the only way they could keep a bar afloat is it's publicly owned. And they decided to form a cooperative. And so, years of organizing, I feel like they just felt so depressed. And in like the height of their frustration, they took a different step forward and is now a remarkably successful network serving a lot of all those towns that were involved. A lot of the townships have fiber or wireless, and most of the townships have wireless. It's a little more rural. And so we detail all of that, how they organized it, how they pulled off the financing, which was really a challenge. And the situation is just that, like, there was multiple times along that over the years where they just like, I don't know, maybe we just wasted 3 years of our lives trying to do this thing. And then, they got to a point where they were able to make it work. I don't know of a situation where a community has started organizing and it just like got done. It's not a situation where it's like, yes, like we were enthusiastic, we worked together, and then a year later we had a string of victories and we celebrated and went on with our lives. Like, it's usually a little bit more of a hard luck story than that. So speaking of hard luck rural stories, I mean, this is a significant one here.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yes. Yeah, exactly. Speaking of hard luck, and this is one of my favorite stories in terms of community engagement and kind of a David against Goliath a story. So there's a community in Louisiana, East Carroll Parish, which is actually it's located in I think it's the northeastern part of the state, one of the worst connected areas of the state, even though there is a cable provider in that area. I think it's Cable One, and they rebranded as Sparklight. And so on maps, and if you talk to folks at, say, the federal level or maybe even at the state level, they'd say, oh, that community is already served. So no real need there. But in fact, there was, when you talk to the people in the local community who actually experienced that the substandard service that was being called served in that area. And so Connects on Connect, which is a small to mid-size independent ISP that especially Chris is very familiar with, and they've been doing fiber builds throughout rural communities across mostly the Southeast. They were interested in building a fiber network in that area, as were a faith-based community who began to really organize around the connectivity challenges in that community, particularly as it related to things like telehealth and school and so forth. And so that partnership essentially led to Connexon, in partnership with this community, to applying for a state grant to apply for $4 million. They call it the Gumbo grant in Louisiana. I think it's one of the most, I love that name for a state broadband grant program, Gumbo. It's something like granting unserved municipal broadband. I forget the exact acronym, but I love it. Anyhow, Connexon and East Carroll Parish received a $4 million grant. The governor came to announce that they were getting this grant, that finally one of the most poorly connected communities in the state of Louisiana was about to get fiber service. And then the cable company said, wait a minute, we already serve this area. So they filed a challenge. meaning that the way the state's rules are, and this is true in most states, if a company can demonstrate that they already serve an area, they don't want to. The states do not want to fund what is called quote unquote overbuilding, what us end users call competition, but in this space it's called overbuilding. And so they made these claims about how well they serve that area. Well, the state ultimately agreed with Delta Interfaith and Connexon that not only was that area poorly underserved, but a lot of the claims that the cable company was making about exactly where they serve were untrue. Eventually, they were able to overcome that, and right now are on the cusp of enjoying fiber connectivity in that community at affordable rates. And right now, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the technology is working to see if maybe we
That's
can
where,
watch
with the time crunch we are, we'll just encourage people to watch.
it. Okay, it's a
Yeah,
good,
to watch it.
it's a good video that centers one of the women involved with Delta Interfaith, and she talks a little bit about her journey, and there's some other folks in there, and not only about the journey, but just how empowering and enlivening that experience was, though they were faced with setbacks, but how much sweeter the victory was.
Yeah, this is not a place that is like, the kind of place you would expect an ISP to say, we're going to invest a significant amount of money. It was their organizing and working. And in part, I mean, we have people visiting here from other parts of the country and other parts of the globe to listen in on this discussion today. But oddly enough, Delta Interfaith was one of those folks who was listening in when there was like discussions in Minnesota or discussions in New England or things like that to see what they could learn. So it was really that local organizing is what got them to where they needed to be.
Yes. We can go to that next slide. So the point of all of these examples, whether it's the New Hampshire Electric Cooperative or whether those groups of local towns that formed in Massachusetts, whether it's a single community that like Fairlawn that decides to build something, or whether they're electric cooperatives, all of these efforts are what we would call the community broadband approach. Where it's community centric, ground up solutions, where people in the community are engaged on these issues, come together, learn this stuff, and really seek out alternative pathways that may very well need to be sought after in communities that BEAD ultimately doesn't reach. And so on this slide here, I ended up coming across this picture from the Appalachian Electric Cooperative, which serves Appalachian Tennessee. And of course, that picture there showing, it's a community that came together 100 years ago to get electricity out there. And now they are serving gig speed fiber broadband as well. That bottom left picture is from their current offices, holding up that sign just about bragging about the wares that they're now offering. But it's not just there. There's as we've alluded to already, electric cooperatives, particularly in rural areas, are really at the leading edge of a lot of efforts to bring fiber to rural communities. Some states are even, I believe it's Virginia, that's making that a central part of their plan. But there are others. There's the Tri-County Electric Cooperative doing a fiber build in the Appalachian region of Pennsylvania. You've got sorry, lost my place here. Get back to the right slide on my end. And then you've got the People's Telephone Cooperative. Not just electric cooperatives, but telephone cooperatives have also made forays into providing fiber broadband service, like the People's Telephone Cooperative in Kentucky. The point of this really is just to remind you not only that community matters, but that people tend to think of getting something built as soon as possible. But we like to point out that getting it right is what's really important, because this is something that will have impact for generations. And so to that extent, it's super important not only for the community to be engaged now as we're in this moment with all of this activity and with BEAD going on, but to not let that create a false timeline, because it's much more important to get this right than it is to do it fast. And at this point, I think we're going to get the last few slides where we talk a little bit touch on some digital equity stuff. And Chris, why don't you go ahead and take us there.
Yeah, so we're gonna still have time for some questions. The Providence, Rhode Island example is one, and there's a link there to a great conversation that I had with the woman who was running this project. But there's a situation where it was the worst healthcare outcomes in the state of Rhode Island, and it's within Providence, this community Olneyville. And as the pandemic hit, they decided that they really needed to have some kind of network. Now, we call this a gap network. This is a network that is not designed for that most people can necessarily access it from within their homes. It's not the permanent long-term solution. If you're into rescuing pets, it's not the forever home of broadband, but it is something you can get up quickly and offer often free. And so we talked with them about how they did it and the longer term approach. It's important to note, like, they've done a wonderful job, but if you listen to that podcast there, Jen, she talks about how, like, this is hard, and they really want to find someone else to hand it off to. That's the reality. Like, I can't tell you that this is something where it's like, get to work and it's going to be super rewarding and it's going to all work out. Like, even though it probably will be rewarding, it was something that will be difficult, and we don't have any other opportunities right now except for doing the hard work and hoping that we have better opportunities that arise from that to make it easier over time. And so that's one example. And there's a lot of, on that link, you'll also find they did a wonderful case study. Not everyone does a great job documenting what they've done. These folks did. The technology they used, how they organized it, is a wonderful case study PDF that is worth reading if you have any interest in how they've organized for this wireless solution, primarily wireless. The other example that I wanted to share in terms of digital equity, getting a little bit beyond the infrastructure, is, Sean, would you mind digging that link out and sharing that in the chat from the case study of the one neighborhood builders? The other example that I like to share is this one, E2D, Eliminate the Digital Divide. This is something that that just gets to, you have a kid in 2012, a kid in Mecklenburg County, in a more wealthy part of Mecklenburg County, which is where Charlotte is, and then some of the suburbs around there. And she was basically like, what about the kids in my class that don't have internet access at home? What are we going to do about it to make sure they're not left behind? And so that family started a project. It's called E2D. It's been super inspirational. One of the things that they did is they're like, we don't even know which families we're targeting to try to make sure they have a device and training and home access. And what they did was they talked to the teachers. The teachers know, right? Like, for a lot of the information that you're seeking, it's not a matter that nobody knows this. It's a matter of, like, it is hard to figure out how to get the information, but it's out there. In their case, they worked with the schools. The schools were able to really be helpful. And before the pandemic hit, they made sure that every family in that school had internet access. And so they didn't have a single child who was going home not able to do their homework because of that organizing. They've learned a lot of lessons. They're working in actually Western North Carolina now too. We've just actually did some work with them earlier this year, and they're doing wonderful things. It's a great organization to see how they've been moving along. The last one, and again here, I'm going to push most of the work to a video if you're interested in this. Cruise.io is a existing provider. They've been around for a long time in the Santa Cruz area, which is both urban and rural. And they wanted to do more. They struck up a partnership with schools. There again, schools are a major potential partner. They got on the rooftop of schools and they began offering a very low cost connection to families that have been identified. We saw this in Boulder as well with a different approach. This is not a way to solve all of the problems, but it is a way to get to many of the families in need by striking up these partnerships. When the pandemic hit, these folks at Cruise.io, they went and they started raising money basically from people who would pay extra on their bills, or they would give money. They worked with a local foundation to take that money and be able to offer a very low internet connection cost because the community was basically helping to pay for it. And so they were like, it's sort of like crowdfunding in some ways. That's something that might become more important without the Affordable Connectivity Program, which leads us into the close of our presentation. Sean?
That's right. And I know that we've got, I believe, a couple of questions in the chat. So I want to quickly just mention this so we can get to at least talking about some questions and look forward to, engaging office hours if need be. But the Affordable Connectivity Program, as all of you are aware now, what that is, I believe, the $30 a month rebate essentially for qualifying low income households. A very important program, not only to obviously get end users online, but also I think very important to the business case for providers to even want to build in areas where a sizable portion of folks would need to rely on the ACP in order to get service. But this, to me, what's going on now. So the ACP was $14 billion funded. This what you see here is our ACP dashboard tracker, and according to our tracker, and now it's widely accepted and known, is that the fund is running out of money. In fact, will probably run out maybe as early as March, April of this year. So in the next few months. In fact, we just got word today that the FCC this week may be sending out notice that no new enrollees can sign up for the program. There are some bills that are being suggested to fund this program moving forward. I'm not confident any of them will be passed, first of all, at all, but certainly in the near term, at least without severe changes to the way ACP works. But this is just another example, I think, of why we can't solely just throw our hands in the air, rely on the federal government to solve all of our connectivity needs, because we've been talking a lot about infrastructure, but even when the infrastructure is there, if it's not affordable, it's not accessible. All of these things point to finding other pathways to solve these challenges. And so as we get to this last slide, I hope that you leave with some of these as key takeaways, which is that we've got a number of local leaders who really think someone else is going to solve the problem. And in our experience, it doesn't work.
Sean, I think we maybe will take a question or two and let people just read those.
Yeah, hi, guys. Thank you so much for that. I want to read a couple of questions that came through, and we'll see if you guys can answer them in short succession, because I know we're close on time. The first question we have are, what are some resources in my community that we might leverage as we are talking to ISPs? What might we own that we don't know about? And it looks like we had a couple of responses in the chat. Do you like to expand on that?
Yeah, I'll go first on that. And I think one is getting the word out there. Like, I think there's a lot of people don't really have a sense of what their options are for internet access. And so, the ability for the community to help spread the word on that. And that might not be an official municipal action. It might be more like a grassroots group that helps us do some marketing and things like that. But if you're able to increase the market share for an ISP, you're basically giving them a subsidy, right? Like, it's a lot more revenue per month. And so one of the things that ISPs will prioritize when they're trying to figure out where to make investments is how likely they are to get a larger market share. If you can help them to achieve that, that's one thing. Now, if you're talking about a wireless ISP, vertical things, it's not going to solve the problem for everyone. And so, like, that's going to be a challenge, but it might be for a fiber optic ISP. It might be a permitting partnership, which might not just be waiving the costs. It might be being proactive and making sure they're returned quickly and predictably so that the company can be effective in how it's building. It might be giving some land that you could build huts on and things like that. So there's a number of different options that go even further.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'd like to read just from Mike McCarthy, which thank you for adding to the conversation, Mike. He says that it's always important to focus on the physical layer of network access. Communities should research conduit in their local government websites. Conduit is the pipe underground that can be used to install fiber optics. Who owns it is very important. Communities may own conduits that could be used to expand internet access via partnering with a local ISP. That's a great insight, Mike. Do you have anything else you'd like to share about that?
No, he makes a great point. One thing I will say though is that that's one of the things that inspires what they call dig once policies, which is something that communities can advocate for. So people don't like roads ripped up, but it's like if the roads are ripped up and there isn't conduit there, it's sometimes for a lot of communities, it's a good time to put some conduit in underground.
Yeah, and one of the things that I'll share is that there's a woman in the westernmost county of Maryland, whose name is just escaping me. She's a brilliant IT person. She in that county, they had invested in a ability to put conduit underground, and so when they had public works people that were not busy, that didn't have a high pressing schedule, they would install some conduit, and then one of the cable companies actually would use that because it lowered their cost to get to some neighborhoods. And so, like some of this, we call it outside plant work, is stuff that if you have, a city that where you can throw that into the schedule, even if it's not part of that dig once that Sean mentioned, there are some ways, and this is more common in rural areas where you have more kind of like, handshake deals and in informal arrangements than in a place where you might have to go more by the book.
Great. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more under the radar. We only have 2 minutes left, but one of our audience members says that we aren't planning to apply for BEAD. So what's a good argument to get my city council on board? Do you have any examples where something went poorly because the community wasn't involved in connectivity planning?
John, anything come to mind quick?
Oh, geez. No, not a specific example, but I just think I think you make a good, I think it can be a good case could be made that lack of engagement is what is history repeating itself, where you've got different business models, and it makes it so easy for ISPs to overlook parts of the community who have been historically underserved and will remain so because they're not economically attractive.
Yeah, and I would note sometimes an argument is helped by who makes it. So if you're talking about city council, it may help in a public hearing to have a child who doesn't have high quality, a 12-year-old who doesn't have high quality internet access or any internet access, to talk about how it needs to be a priority. It can help to have the business community, sending the same message. So you can use the same words, but coming from different people, it may have much greater impact. And I think the last thing I would just say is that, like, this is something that a lot of people are intimidated by. And so you want to try and you can acknowledge that at the beginning of a meeting. You can say, I'm not an expert, you're not an expert, but this is a priority. Like, just take that out, because everyone's nervous about talking about tech, and just own up to it and then figure out how to talk about it in a way that makes sense for you.